Right now, somewhere in your kitchen, there is probably a food sitting in a bag or a bin that has started wars, toppled governments, and killed over 1 million people. It's not some exotic delicacy. It's not some rare spice smuggled across dangerous borders. It's the potato. For most of us, it's boring. It's the side dish. The thing you mash, you fry, you forget. But the history of potatoes is one of the wildest stories in human civilization. It's a story about survival, about empire, about superstition, and about one of the deadliest famines in modern European history. So how did a knobby little tuber, grown 8,000 years ago in the thin freezing air of the Andes, end up conquering the entire planet? One French fry at a time? Let's dig in. Literally, long before Rome, before the pyramids of Giza, before almost anything you call ancient history, there were farmers in the Andes Mountains, near Lake Titicaca, doing something extraordinary. They were domesticating a wild, bitter, nearly inedible plant into what we now call Solanum tuberosum, the potato dot. And here's the twist. A potato isn't a root. It's a tuber, a swollen underground stem, the plant's own survival kit, for storing energy through brutal conditions. And the Andes were brutal. Thin soil, punishing sunlight by day, frost by night, rain you couldn't predict. Most crops would have failed here. The potato didn't just survive, it thrived over thousands of years. Indigenous farmers selectively bred it for bigger tubers, better flavor, frost resistance, pest resistance. They didn't rely on one variety. They planted dozens, sometimes hundreds, across different elevations, so that if frost or drought wiped out one field, the others would survive. That single decision, genetic diversity as insurance, would matter more than anyone could have imagined. Because centuries later, an entire nation would forget this lesson and pay for it in blood. By the time the Inca Empire rose to power in the 5th century, the potato wasn't just food. It was infrastructure. The Inca used potatoes to feed armies, pay taxes, stockpile emergency reserves, and conduct religious ceremonies. In regions too high and cold for maize to grow, the potato was the only thing standing between a community and starvation. But the Inca's greatest potato innovation wasn't a farming technique. It was a preservation trick so effective, it borders on ancient science fiction. It's called Chuño, freeze-dried potato, created a full 500 years before freeze-drying was ever invented in a lab. Here's how it worked. Potatoes were left outside overnight to freeze solid in the Andean cold. Then, by day, the sun would thaw them. Workers would trample them underfoot to squeeze out the moisture. Repeat this cycle: freeze, thaw, stomp, over and over. The result? A lightweight dehydrated potato that could last not months, not years, but reportedly up to a decade. Chuño meant the Inca could feed soldiers on long campaigns and survive famine years. That would have crushed less prepared societies. Then came the Spanish. When conquistadors pushed into the Inca Empire in the 16th century, they weren't hunting for tubers. They wanted gold, silver, treasure they could ship home by the crate. The potato was, to them, an afterthought, a humble food for sailors and miners. But almost by accident, this afterthought would end up reshaping the world. Far more than any shipment of silver ever could, potatoes were swept up into what historians call the Columbian Exchange, the massive transfer of crops, animals, and diseases between the Americas and the rest of the world. After 1492, by the late 1500s, the potato had landed in Spain. From there, it began a slow, awkward, often distrusted migration across the rest of Europe. Because here's the thing, Europeans did not welcome the potato with open arms. Not even close. Imagine showing up to a village with a strange, lumpy vegetable that grows in the dirt. and telling people it's dinner. That's basically what happened for decades. Many Europeans treated the potato with outright suspicion. Why? First, it wasn't mentioned anywhere in the Bible. For deeply religious communities, that alone made it suspect. Second, the potato belongs to the nightshade family, the same family as deadly poisonous plants. Its leaves and green parts actually are toxic. So when some people mistakenly ate the wrong part of the plant and got sick, the rumor spread like wildfire. This crop is poisoned. Third, it grew underground. In an era when clean food came from sunlit fields, anything pulled from the dirt was seen by some as unnatural, even dirty, fit only for animals or the desperately poor. And finally, accepting the potato meant abandoning centuries of farming tradition, built around wheat, rye, barley, and oats. So for a long stretch of European history, the potato wasn't dinner. It was a curiosity, a strange ornamental plant grown in noble gardens. Just to look at, that was about to change. Dramatically, it took a prisoner of war and a king to finally convince Europe that the potato was safe to eat. Meet Antoine-Augustin Parmentier, a French pharmacist captured during the 7 Years' War and held prisoner in Prussia. While imprisoned, he survived largely on one food: potatoes. He didn't just survive. He became obsessed. When Parmentier returned to France, he launched a full-blown publicity campaign to convince a skeptical public that this poisonous plant was actually nutritious and safe. His methods were, frankly, brilliant marketing. He hosted lavish dinners built entirely around potato dishes and served them to influential guests. Legend even claims he planted potato fields and stationed guards around them by day, only to pull the guards away at night, letting curious peasants steal the crop and grow it themselves. Meanwhile, in Prussia, King Frederick the Great took a more direct approach. Facing grain shortages and war, he ordered farmers to plant potatoes as a matter of national food security. Between royal decree and calculated propaganda, the potato's reputation flipped. What was once poison was now survival. What was once dirty was now a matter of state policy. And once Europe accepted the potato, everything changed. Here's why the potato mattered so much compared to grain. Potatoes produced far more food energy per acre of land. They grew in poor soil. They tolerated cool, wet climates that would ruin a wheat harvest for a struggling family with only a small plot of land. That difference was the difference between hunger and survival. By the late 1700s, potatoes were feeding huge portions of Ireland, the Netherlands, Belgium, Prussia, and Eastern Europe, and the effects rippled outward. More food meant families could support more children. More food meant fewer shortages. More food meant grain that used to feed people could now feed livestock or be sold for profit. Historians point directly to the potato as one of the driving forces behind Europe's dramatic population explosion. In the 18th and 19th centuries, it fed the farms. It fed the factories. It fed the cities. The Industrial Revolution needed cheap, reliable calories to keep workers alive and working, and the potato delivered. But there was a dark side to this success story, and nowhere would that dark side reveal itself more violently than in Ireland. Ireland's cool, DMP climate turned out to be almost perfect for potatoes. And for Ireland's poorest tenant farmers working tiny plots of land they didn't even own, the potato wasn't just convenient. It was essential. A single small field of potatoes could feed an entire family for a year. No other crop could do that. But over generations, millions of Irish families became almost totally dependent on one food. And worse, dependent on essentially one variety, known as the Irish lumper. Remember that ancient Andean strategy of planting dozens of different varieties. As insurance against disaster, Ireland had abandoned it completely in 1845. A microscopic organism called Phytophthora infestans arrived in Irish fields. It caused a disease known as late blight. Leaves turned black. Tubers rotted in the ground, turning to a foul-smelling mush. Almost overnight, the 1845 harvest was devastated. 1846 was even worse. But here's the part that turns this from a crop failure into a full-blown catastrophe. The blight was only the spark. Ireland was already trapped by deep poverty, unequal land ownership, insecure tenant farming, and a British government whose relief policies were slow, inadequate, and in some cases openly indifferent, even as people starved. Ireland continued exporting food. The human toll is almost impossible to comprehend. Between 1845 and the early 1850s, roughly 1 million people died. More than 1 million more fled the country entirely, scattering to America, Canada, Britain, Australia, forever reshaping the Irish diaspora. The Great Famine wasn't just a tragedy caused by a plant disease. It was a warning, written in the starkest terms possible, about what happens when a society abandons diversity for the fragile efficiency of monoculture. Despite the tragedy in Ireland, the potato's march across the globe didn't slow down. If anything, it accelerated European colonization. Trade and migration carried the potato into India, where it became so deeply woven into regional cooking. Samosas, aloo gobi, dosas, that many people today assume it's always been native to South Asia. In China, the potato found a home in mountainous northern regions, where rice simply couldn't grow, eventually becoming critical to the country's food security. In colonial Africa, it took root in cooler highland regions, while across Russia and Eastern Europe, it became a staple and, notably, the base ingredient for distilled spirits. By the 20th century, the potato wasn't a regional curiosity anymore. It was a global staple, grown on every inhabited continent on Earth. And the next chapter of its story wouldn't be written by farmers or kings. It would be written by chemists, engineers, and fast food executives. The Industrial Revolution didn't just change how potatoes were grown. It changed what they became: mechanized harvesting, chemical fertilizers, refrigerated shipping, industrial-scale processing. Thin, fried potato slices had existed in various forms for generations, but they became commercially standardized in the 19th century, eventually turning into the potato chip we know today. French fries followed a similar path, their true origins still fiercely debated between France and Belgium before exploding in popularity. Through 20th century restaurants and fast food chains, then came frozen French fries. Suddenly, potatoes could be processed in one location, frozen, shipped across entire continents, and cooked to identical, crispy perfection in kitchens thousands of miles from any farm. That single innovation turned the fry into arguably the most recognizable food symbol of global fast food culture. Today, the potato is the world's third most important food crop for direct human consumption, behind only rice and wheat. Over 1 billion people eat it. Global production tops 300 million metric tons a year. But there's a quiet warning buried in that success. Modern commercial farming relies heavily on a small handful of standardized varieties, the exact same vulnerability that devastated Ireland in the 1840s. Meanwhile, back where this story began, Andean farmers still cultivate thousands of traditional potato varieties, bred for frost, drought, disease, and high-altitude survival. Institutions like the International Potato Center now preserve this genetic diversity in seed banks, racing to protect it before climate change, disease, and industrial farming erase it for good. The irony is almost poetic. The very diversity that indigenous Andean farmers protected for thousands of years may be the thing that saves the modern potato from repeating history. So the next time you're eating a plate of fries or mashing potatoes for dinner, remember what's actually on your plate, not just a side dish, a crop that survived 8,000 years of Andean frost, a crop that fed the Inca Empire and helped build modern Europe, a crop that was once feared as poison, and a crop whose failure helped trigger one of the deadliest famines. In European history, the potato story isn't really about a vegetable at all. It's about us, about how the food we depend on can build civilizations or bring them to their knees. If this video changed the way you look at your dinner plate, hit like and let me know in the comments. What's your favorite piece of food history that most people have never heard of? And if you want more stories like this, where ordinary food hides extraordinary history, subscribe. Because we're just getting started. I'll see you in the next one.